loud. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the 5th Heatherleys Online event. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. Before we get started, as you just heard, I need to remind you that this is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Heatherleys school page as well as to their YouTube site. So I'm Anna McNay, an art writer, editor and curator, and today I have the great pleasure of talking to Crowley, who is a self-declared painter, not an artist, which I'm sure we'll touch upon. And amongst other things, hopefully we're going to touch upon the effect of the legacy of conceptualism on his practice and how he has long resisted the academic orthodoxy's view that painting is dead by continuing to paint and also subvert the traditional genres. So I'm just going to give, I'm sure most of you know Graham's work, but I'm going to give a quick overview of his career to date, just for those of you who maybe don't know it so well. Graham was born in Romford in Essex in 1950. He studied painting at St Martin's School of Art and continued his studies at the Royal College of Art, where he later became a visiting lecturer and in 1998 a professor of painting. In 1982, Graham became artist in residence at Oxford University and a visiting fellow of St Edmund Hall. From 1986 to 89, he became a senior fellow and artist in residence at Cardiff College of Art, as it then was. After that, he taught at Goldsmiths College. Over the years, he's been a visiting lecturer at art schools throughout the UK and Ireland. He's exhibited widely in the UK and abroad and has work in many public and private collections worldwide. He's been selected no less than 10 times and won prizes twice at the John Moores Painting Prize, and in 2008 he became a selector. After a number of years spent living in Ireland, Graham now lives and works in Suffolk. So the plan, basically, for those of you not who haven't been previously, is that Graham and I will talk for approximately 45-ish minutes, thereabouts, and I'll be sharing slides of his work as we go. And then we will open up to questions, but I have muted everyone just so that the sound quality is as good as possible. So what I'd ask is, there's those of you, I'm sure everyone knows Zoom by heart by now, but there is a chat box kind of in the middle bottom of your screen. So if you could type any questions into that, either as they occur to you if you think you'll forget, which I know I would, or at the end if you want, and then I'll read them from there at the end and we'll get through as many as we possibly can, time permitting. Okay, are you ready, Graham?
Yes.
Brilliant. So we're sort of going vaguely chronologically, although we might jump about a little bit depending on themes that might come up, but this is a fairly early work in which you're appropriating the style of the French Cubist artist Fernand Léger. So firstly, can you explain a bit about the context in which this particular work was made, and also why it's significant for you to appropriate from an early work, and in particular from this artist?
Okay, right. Well, it's 1977, and this painting was made shortly after leaving the Royal College of Art. 76, 77, there was a lot of, what should we say, appropriation or borrowing going on in culture more widely. Obviously, postmodern architecture, punk was quoting from early kind of pop. Umberto Eco wrote Name of the Rose, which quotes heavily from Zadig by, oh, I've forgotten his name.
Voltaire?
Voltaire, thank you very much, yes. Anyway, so there's a lot of borrowing going on. And the reason that was going on, and the thing you have to realise is a little bit of history leading into this moment, is that there was such consensus about the idea that painting was exhausted, it was dead, it has had its day, move over, conceptualise here. And by the way, there's a lot of sort of mistake and thinking about this. In fact, the Turner Prize, always through the 80s and 90s, was always sort of billed as painting versus conceptual art, right? Which is a false dichotomy. I mean, that's just journalism, as far as I'm concerned. That and stupidity. Just trying, yes, exactly. Hang your head. It's trying to sort of create a simple sort of, what's it called? Soundbite, yeah? Okay, right. So, but one of the things that's very, very real and very, very important about this was, as I say, the strategy that I and another group who identified as painters. And the point we did that was to differentiate ourselves from the very many different media that were going on. And it's not because I have a problem with performance or video, far from it. I have no problem with that. As far as I'm concerned, the one great aspect of the legacy of conceptual art is that it gave us a level playing field again, right? That's the upshot. That's the irony of all this, in spite of the misconception that there was some dichotomy, it was somehow threatened by, etc., or threatening painting. That's not the case, right? Anyway, so the modernism is at the heart of this. It's a crisis in modernism. In the late 60s, it had become so codified, it had created its own academic orthodoxy. There was a lot of rhetoric about big pluralism and being open and being able to do what you like and all that kind of, sort of open and free type stuff. But in actual fact, there was it was very clear that there was a right and lots of wrong ways and one right way to do it, okay? And one of the right ways was not to paint. So I thought, right, to hell with that. I don't want approval, because I went into this, don't forget, it's 1968. And the idea of dissent, the idea of sort of becoming irksome or irritating has always had a certain appeal, because I found that the most difficult and most real, if you like. The idea of all being on the same page and all being happily sort of, agreeing and, sort of club of the like-minded is for me the idea of intellectual mogadon. I just sort of, it's not my thing. So right at the centre of one of this crisis of modernism and postmodernism was the idea of originality. Mm-hmm. And I think I, like a hell of a lot of younger people in those days, realised that the chances of being original, as in the sense of, it's just untenable. It was all about novelty. It was about shock and novelty. And we were falling for the kind of, sorry, I've got to change something on that. We were falling for the kind of hype of modernism. Anyway, so one way of actually facing up to that was borrowing, just going straight out there and using it. The license was in culture more widely, as I've stated earlier on, and I travelled a lot and I looked at a lot of work all over the place. I'm not going to go on about how much I've travelled, but one thing happened. I found the work of Leger absolutely compelling. The second sort of shift, as it were, or the second wave of Cubism, but his early work, Contraste des Formes, which he made prior to the First World War, had a certain kind of, what I saw as, there was a kind of sort of a rhythm to them. There was a funkiness to them, yeah? And I enjoyed that idea of that, because obviously, don't forget, we're always coming back at art history backwards, yeah? Which is an interesting idea. I mean, obviously, I'll just digress for a second. I'm passionately interested in the Ashcan school, right? Stuart Davis, Don Sloan, George Bellows, I can go on and on, right? And the group of seven, Tom Thompson and that. And what fascinated me about them was that I was able to look at the European art that they had looked at, painting they'd looked at, and invariably it led back to, obviously, Picasso, and that led back to Cézanne, the syntax, the grammar of paintings like this Leger rip, as it were, but also back to Manet. Because that's, for me, see, that's the essential dualism of painting, and I'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
The window on the world, and round about the latter part of the 19th century, is the painting, the thing itself, become aestheticized, yeah? So you get this wonderful duality, like alternating current. You can't see it, but it's fused into one. And when you see a Manet flower painting, for instance, you are acknowledging the intrinsic beauty of the subject matter, but the beauty of the subject matter and the intrinsic beauty of the object, the painting, the thing itself. So it's 76, 77. This is painted with a pointing trowel. There are no concessions to the finesse. It's painted with acrylic paint, something I decided to stop using for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And it's literally borrowing very heavily, but at the same time trying to misappropriate, because the one thing I've always done is painted against genre, as somebody put it recently. And so you see these illusionistic or depicted shadows, something that wouldn't have happened in a Cubist painting, definitely not in a Leger painting of this period. So it's called Head 2 because I wanted a hanger, some formal, iconic sort of, some convention to hang it all on rather than it be seemingly arbitrary. The trouble with this sort of painting was that it wasn't sustaining. That's really where I'd leave it. And that's why, but it's the beginnings of a journey, yeah? Because I see my work not as a progression, but it's a life. You know, I've changed, things have changed, and the world has changed around me. Imperatives and things that engage and concern me have shifted.
Okay, brilliant. So this, again, you're taking another genre as well, still life in this instance, but you're deliberately, again, working against that genre, I guess. And
that's exactly the thing. Basically, if something has a bad press, I'm immediately attracted to it. We'll come to flower painting later on because that was sort of like a, you know, a sort of art world jokes practically by then, or had been by the 50s. But talking to the 50s, there was a school of painting in Britain after the neo-romantics. There was this kind of sort of gritty post-war austerity, rationing realism. But remember, I was born in 1950, so I remember rationing, and I also remember bombed out houses, which we'll come to later, you know, bomb damage from the Second World War. So one of the genre of painting that was getting a really bad press at the time was the kitchen sink, the kind of, the idea of painting about domesticity was laughed out of court because here was kind of Pollock, here were the Americans, here was Joseph Beuys, here was Gilbert and George. Everybody was dealing with bigger, wider, what seemed more edgy issues. And I thought, that's brilliant, yes. So it's the fact that it was declared dead, you know, hopeless and withering on the vine, made it all the more attractive. Because you can see what I'm getting at. The idea of going with the consensus is exactly that. I mean, it's like an anesthetic. It's acquiescing to the dominant discourse, as they say, which was allegedly the problem with painting. And anyway, so I started painting what are ostensibly still lives. And then I thought, well, one way of sort of painting against that, and I've got to credit Judith Tucker with coming up with that expression, because that's hers. One way of dealing with that was to make it seem animated. And obviously at this time, we've got Guston is probably the most influential, seminal character in postmodernism, carried over from late modernism into postmodernism. But quotes, and I don't know how many of your viewers know this, but quoted very heavily from Robert Crumb, the West Coast comics, comics with an X, which are very, very big in the late 60s. And these are precursors to the graphic novel. But that also interests me because from being sort of rather esoteric almost with the formalism and the appropriation of the Cubist paintings, I decided that I wanted not to paint for 16 people, but for a much wider audience, as it were, and also paint about a much wider range of subject matter. I wanted to be my life, not a preoccupation for a few months. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And move away from being smart or clever into being kind of to giving shape and meaning to a life, or my life more correctly. Anyway, so
I'll just move on whilst you're talking about him.
Okay, so basically I made these drawings of domestic objects. I started painting with oil paint, and these are paintings that are both Spider with Mushroom Soup, which was the still life. Doesn't sound very appetizing. Well, it's not meant to sound very appetizing. There's a spider down in there somewhere. It's just above the plug hole.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, everything is flying around in a rather kinetic sort of space. Go on to the next painting, because as I say, it's another sort of stab at genre. This painting, incidentally, was stolen a few years ago from an exhibition in Southend. I'm not going to go into that, and I'm assuming it's now been destroyed. But I've had a facsimile. So there you are. That's a real piece of postmodern, real postmodernism. There is a full-size digital copy of it. It was exhibited in Peterborough and Ireland recently. And this is called 3B. it was shown in a show that travelled in America quite widely, called Comic Iconoclasm in 1982, 83, I think. Anyway, and both of these paintings, the not so still life, as it were, and this sort of, again, painting against the genre of, the cliche of sort of the eyes follow you around the room and all that insightful kind of, slightly kind of questionable psychobabble about self-portraiture, which irritates the hell out of me. It's a grisaille. Both of these are grisaille, okay? Spelt grisaille, but grisaille, it's how it's pronounced. I'll come on to that a little bit later.
Yes.
That led me into, and this is important, I wanted to paint in a labour-intensive and archaic fashion. Again, against history, against the kind of consensus, because it meant you had to think harder, yeah? You put yourself out there rather than sort of running with the herd, running with the pack, wanting to belong to gang A or gang B. And that's also another reason why I identified as a painter, because I believe painting is a discourse, and my discourse, which is historically based, as well as, contemporaneous and through lived experience and stuff, is fashioned by my knowledge and my love of painting, my passion for painting. Because painting, somebody asked me about it recently, without it, I think my life personally would be without form, without sort of, I wouldn't have a focus. I wouldn't have anything to do, but that's slightly overstating it, but it's near the mark. Anyway, this painting, I started to glaze this painting, and I'll come on to that later because I've taken that to greater lengths. But one of the things began to happen was I noticed that with oil paint, just for a second, a very practical thing, and I'm sure lots of your viewers will know this, that if you took cerulean blue, cerulean blue, and added white, it would always produce an opaque surface on a painting. It would be like the Wedgwood plate is to the distance. And the distance, if that were painted in the cerulean blue with oil, that would be the sky. It would be a vast space, but it would not be the surface. And this wonderful, just practical, this technique that had been sidelined, knocked out of the ballpark because it wasn't immediate, it wasn't a vehicle for expression. The idea of authenticity was tied up with getting it out before your brain gets a chance to check it out, which is quite frankly idiotic because it's the brain that decided to get it out there before the brain checks it out. It's a catch-22 that, I don't know about you, but I can't outrun that one. Anyway, so this painting, in one of the reviews of the show, somebody described Comic Iconoclasm as a shed load of PhDs, illustrations of PhDs, with only one or two funny paintings, laugh out loud paintings, and this was one of them, cited as actually funny, which I think is an accolade, to be painting about the humorous and for it to be funny. And don't forget, trying to paint paintings that are funny is a pretty thankless task, because what is funny for a nanosecond before you hit the canvas ain't very funny by the time it's dry, and it certainly ain't funny 25, 30 years down the line.
Yeah, what's funny to you mightn't be funny to others. So you've touched upon the idea of taking something that's sort of domestic and familiar and making it unfamiliar.
Yeah, that's at the centre of my project. I mean, it's the joke about there are only three ideas in literature, and one of them is to make the familiar unfamiliar, etc. So I cleave to that.
Yeah. Well, so this is a quite uncanny triptych, if you like, and I mean, everything's kind of skew-if, and it's a bit like being in a dream. What were you responding to here particularly? Okay.
Right, well, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of the left-hand panel, you can see some little Lego figures on the floor.
Okay, yeah.
Anybody who's got children will know about the broken ankles. You wake up at night and, of course, you twist your tread on a piece of Lego and you swear quite loudly, of course, which is something you don't want to do in your kids' room. Anyway, basically, this is, again, nothing is more absurd after Guernica than trying to paint a history painting, right? I mean, exactly, you laugh. But that's the point. It's the idea of the level of ambition it's not located because it's large, which is a kind of modernist cliche, you know, ambition was measured by sort of square meterage, whatever. No, this is actually a painting about childhood, about parenthood, and about the journey through life, right? But it's also essentially, it's called Peripheral Vision. There's an earlier version called The Poetics of Space, which was the title of a Gaston Bachelard book, which was massively influential in the 50s. And Foucault and people like that were all massively influenced by Bachelard. Yeah. Anyway, this is called Peripheral Vision. And the one important thing about this painting to remember is it's asymmetrical.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a triptych that is, you know, with the hinged doors that folded so it could go on a cart from Ghent to somewhere else, right? This is a painting made in around about 1990, and I didn't give you an image of this before it is glazed. This is entirely glazed, or these paintings are entirely glazed. And if you look carefully, you'll see the colour moves from the left panel into the sky of the centre panel, which moves into the panel on the right-hand side. You see the edges? The colour is, because they're painted up tight to each other, clamped together, they're glazed together. But before they're glazed, these paintings, and this is a large painting, I think it's about 110 foot wide, the whole thing.
Okay.
It's painted in a white impasto, and that means taking a tiny piece of paint, squeezing it out of a tube and pressing it on to the canvas. And so that all of the imagery that you see here is drawn, for want of a better term, into the paint.
Okay.
In a shallow relief. It's in impasto, okay? That is left to dry then for about 2 or 3 months because I want it rock hard, and then the whole thing is coated with a polymerized resin, liquid of something similar, right? And into the liquid is floated the pigment. I don't use a palette. I allow the colors to mix on the surface, so it's a retinal thing, which is again going back to, you know, what you say, earlier, almost archaic forms of painting. But the thing I wanted to reclaim, and that's a major part of what I think has been happening all the way through my time as a painter, is the idea of moving from the end of some kind of history and reclaim a project of reclamation and reclaiming genre, even if it seems absurd and they're declared dead, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago. That's not a disincentive, okay? Right. But the thing that is essential about this painting is reciprocity, the idea of reciprocity, because if you take the view that you are in an interior on the left, right? Okay, that's an interior, and that is also an interior on the right, slightly cut about, slightly sort of, it's like a kind of cross between a demolition, a diagram of wiring and a bit of a cubist space, so it's a shallow space and everything's foreshortened, etc. And the exterior, the centre, is the exterior of a house without walls, i.e. you in this fictitious magical realist, I think is the genre that is probably most appropriate to this sort of painting. You are asked to imagine what it's like to be in a house without walls. Now, somebody of a rather literal frame of mind might have put a sort of ziggy-zaggy brickwork sort of line saying, oh, look, the wall is broken. No, this is an imaginative, it's a psychological space. All of it is a psychological space. It's why I don't subscribe to figurative, non-figurative, because I think all painting is synthetic, yes? And colour, whether it's linear, whether it's perspective, linear perspective, whether it's colour space, it is all synthetic. And anyway, so this is massively labour intensive, as are the flower paintings. And it was a riposte to the idea that authenticity can only be gained through immediacy. Okay. Rest my case.
Absolutely. This one, you're using the same technique, are you? With
white impasto, yeah. That's then glazed. And but this was painted in Cardiff in the late 80s.
Same year, in fact, 87.
I think it's 87. Yeah, you're right. Yes, and it's basically, again, it's a kind of socio-political history painting. Yeah. It's the transformation, because I was in Cardiff at a time when the docks had become derelict and ruined, and what was happening is they were being flattened, and rather expensive flats were being built on attractive waterfront places. I mean, it's ubiquitous. It's the the get rich quick sort of redevelopment idea, and then you get a lot of sheds, and one of them was Texas home care in the day. Okay, and a very funny sideline. This painting was shown, and it was featured in the John Moores or something or other, and Kingfisher Holdings that owned Texas, the chain of stores, contacted Edward Tota, who was my dealer at the time in London, and we thought, oh, they want to sue us for copyright. And it wasn't the case. They came to see the painting, and I think, I'm not sure how serious they were. They came to look at it, a couple of them. I wasn't there at the time, and they decided not to buy it because it was too big for the boardroom. I think what they'd realised was that Texas Home Care Centre would be in ruins one day as well. There was this cycle. This wasn't the end of history. Texas wasn't going to be, the promised land. If you look closely, the car parked outside the Texas Home Care Centre has had its wheels nicked. So it's up on bricks. So
brilliant.
Goodbye to that dream. But the whole painting is painted in white and then it's glazed. I spend more time with a cloth taking paint off of the painting than I do with a brush putting the paint on.
I think we'll see that in some of the later ones.
Yeah, you will. Yes. Oh, yes. But yes. But there's before we see the later ones, I eventually have to abandon this form of method of painting because of RSI. But we'll come on to that in a minute.
Yeah, I don't think that's just yet. I think you've got this one, which becomes a one-shot painting. Yeah,
well, this presages that kind of. This is the kind of painting I have. I mean, this is called Small Black City, and it was painted 30 years ago, practically, right? Okay, it's 1991, I think. And what excited me about this painting was the fact that I was obviously painting into the medium with the glazes, and I thought, what happens if you abandon the underpainting? That kind of, all that foundation work, the hours and the labour, because I think I was becoming just impatient, but also I was beginning to be struck with what's called RSI. And so I put a grey glaze across the surface. By the way, the grey I use is Payne's grey, which is wonderful. Anybody who paints knows that Payne's grey, it's the colour of, it's shadow itself. It's kind of, lightlessness. It's wonderful. And I'll come on to the painting of things like shadows and reflections later. Yeah. But anyway, whilst the surface was wet, I took charcoal grey and immediately struck in this second more localised piece of painting. I thought, that's fascinating. I was absolutely fascinated. And I thought, that's really terrific because the image is embedded in the medium.
Yeah.
That could only be a painting. That could only be painted. And I tried to make several versions or, carry on painting a few. And I couldn't get anywhere near it. And I thought, oh, well, just put it away, just move on. And that's what I did. Yeah. Okay. But it's a stalking horse, a harbinger of things to come. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Harbinger is the word.
Another harbinger of things to come. So this one, no such thing. You're actually quoting from something Margaret Thatcher said in a Women's Hour interview with John.
I am indeed. Yes. In fact, by the way, I may be in the studio now, but that's rigged up specially for interviews and stuff, etc. Because I don't have phones, I don't have music, I don't have any noise. I have tinnitus, chronic tinnitus, and I don't need any more noise than the high-pitched whistling that I've got at present, that and my own voice. This is No Such Thing. It's a housing estate on the River Tees. It was painted in the early 90s, 93, I think.
93, yeah.
And I'm not going to go into the full background because there isn't enough time, except to say that it was the location of what was known at the time as the Cleveland scandal, a childcare scandal. It's massively complicated, but it was a subject that was being discussed by Jenny Murray, and she had Margaret Thatcher, who was then Prime Minister. Was she still Prime Minister then? Yes, she was. Yeah. Just before John Major, yeah. It's 1992, because I was doing the residency between 89 and 92. And this painting took almost 6 months to paint because it's a white impasto. The whole thing is massive. And I was listening to this interview and Jenny Murray said something about, yeah, but what about the social impact? And Margaret Thatcher, in that wonderfully haughty and sanctimonious voice, said, but there's no such thing as society. And I thought, what?
Sorry, I'm laughing at your impression, obviously, not the comment.
Oh yeah, no. The comment is, I just thought, you know, what kind of planet you're on, you know. Anyway, so but the thing was, I was trying to paint, and the other thing about this is, I'm trying to paint in a way that is not inaccessible, but isn't sort of dumb. Bad painting for, you know, what is it? Dumb painting for dumb people, sort of thing. None of that. No, this is really, I think, beautifully constructed out of a sense of respect for the audience, but a respect for the history and the activity. It's very, very, there's a great deal of what I think of as it's devotion, yeah? Yeah. But the thing I wanted to make paintings that I think ultimately have a vernacular air about them. Vernacular in the sense that it's sort of something that's grown up out of our collective experience, rather than being imposed by structural engineers or by Style Council or the Tate or the BBC or officialdom or whatever. Okay, grassroots consensus. Yeah. Anyway, so that's that one. But like, as I say, I think we're just about to go on to
flower painting. Yeah, which you've mentioned a couple of times. So I think we've got two of these here. I'll just show you.
Yeah, but one of them that's a drawing. Go back to the painting.
Yeah.
This is a white impasto that is then glazed with Payne's grey and a little bit of charcoal grey. Very briefly, when I told somebody I was thinking of making some flower paintings, they laughed, quite openly, and thought, well, he's at it again. You know, that's absurd. It's flower painting is the preferred genre, the refuge of the amateur and the kind of what should I say? Let's just leave it at that. Actually,
the woman not allowed into the live room as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, so I suddenly realised when I started thinking about flower painting how they had functioned in the 16th and 17th century. And because of this negative press, because they were being so patently dismissed and marginalised, I thought, that's fascinating. That really interests me. People are so convinced that there is no mileage left in this genre, right? Okay, so I do the white impasto. I start in the top right-hand corner, and everything is literally, it's really thick and coarsely painted. And don't forget, when you paint a white impasto, or impasto generally, you're painting inside and outside of the line, which is mentally a very interesting thing. If you press some paint, you're also creating the space around the figure ground thing is happening simultaneously, right? So you're not thinking about figure and ground, you're thinking about paint, and you're thinking about these two things formally separate, but actually integrated while you do it. Yeah. So that sort of stretches your head a bit. Anyway, so then what I would do is it dries, takes about 2 or 3 months, as I say, and then the whole thing is just liquid is painted over the whole surface, or flat on the floor, obviously. So it's rather like varnishing a table with Payne's grey, and the Payne's grey is applied from the bottom left-hand corner to the right-hand top corner, which is where the light will be coming from. Get it? Because all the time, and then of course it's wiped down, and you can see that it has a certain kind of, there's something vivid, something luminous about these pictures, rather like the No Such Thing picture. But that flower paintings particularly, there's something vivid about them. But of course, something I haven't mentioned is that flower paintings are, if they're synonymous with one thing, it's a sense of dominion, it's a sense of colour, it's a sense of everything's right with the world. They're celebratory paintings, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to get into a sort of O-level seminar on sort of global warming or something, but let's just say that doesn't quite stack up as easily as it did in the 17th and 16th century. Okay, we think differently. We know different stuff now. We have different concerns. And I thought, hold on, what happens if you take colour out of the equation? What happens if you go back to the monochrome, to Malevich, to Warhol, to the people who've really made that work, yeah, and resonate? And I thought, yeah. Anyway, so that's why they're monochromatic. And it was, I mean, Payne's grey still counts as a grade. And the one thing I'm not sure if everybody realised, Payne's grey is not a mix of black and white. Any modern charcoal grey is. Payne's grey is made out of viridian, umbers, all sorts of colours that actually, when you put it against another grey, it actually has a faintly blue hue to it. Yeah. Anyway, that's one of about 8 flower paintings I made, and then the RSI set in really badly because I was painting 5 or 6 days a week and 6 to 8 hours a day, and I couldn't raise my arms above that sort of height, and I had to start thinking about other ways of making paintings.
Yeah.
The next picture, if you want to go on to that one, is a drawing made in compressed charcoal, which I thought, right, I'll seal it in resin, using polymerized resin. But the thing was, I picked it up and I left it standing up overnight, but the resin hadn't dried. And so what you get is this extraordinary funereal veil that has fallen down like a pall over the whole picture, okay? And you can just see at the bottom, the gathering runs, and in the bottom left-hand corner are sort of seeping. And I thought, that's extraordinary. You know, that I don't trust happy accidents, right? This is one of the only happy accidents I would ever put my hand up and say, actually, I couldn't have done that any better if I tried, really. Because at that point, I didn't know, you know, maybe 6 months or a year or two later, I suddenly had the thing about the flies and the butterflies creating the space in front of the painting, in front of the flowers, in that inner space, particularly as they're black and white and everything in it is receding tonally into the distance.
So they were added later?
Pardon?
They were added later, were they?
Yes, much later, a year or two later, yes.
Oh, wow, okay. Do you frequently go back to works?
Sorry?
Do you quite often go back to work?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay.
Covering my tracks.
Brilliant. So there's a couple more from before you had to change your style because of the RSI, but we might have to move fairly quickly through them.
Yeah. Yes, Carrie. Yes. Listen, as I say, I've explained the context and the aspirations for most of the paintings, and as I say, this is called heart. It's the idea of at the centre of the painting, and it is an impasto. In fact, if you look carefully at the top, and in fact, if you look above the building in the centre, you see these tiny little little dark flecks. Mm-hmm. That's the actual, where the brush strokes are, right? The flecks of paint. And in fact, at the bush to the left of the 2 sheds, yeah?
Yeah.
I'm saying to the left on my screen. Yes, it is to the left, yeah, that's right, yeah. The painting's over there in the studio. That you can actually see the flecks there where the glaze catches. And as I say, I burnish it down, I rub down, so you get these, what I think of as gaseous. In fact, you'll see a painting in a minute that actually employs the rubbing down to be the actual, becomes subject, yeah.
Is that this one? No.
Yes, it is, Morning. Both of these are painted, they're the locations west of Ireland. My family are from Ireland. I've lived on and off in Ireland for blimey, about a third of my life. And anyway, and this painting, I think, again, if you look at the top, at the horizon, you can see tiny little ridges in the paint, right? So everything is there. The wires, the whole thing is painted as white impasto. And then what I did with this one was slightly different. I painted the buildings, the bungalow, the garage, the sheds and stuff, and the caravan in a local colour on top of the impasto, and then glazed the whole painting when that was dry with Payne's grey and wiped it down. So in the distance, you get cloud shadows running across the landscape, you get forest in shadow, and you get this wonderful raking morning light. This painting was sold about half an hour after I made it, which is great. I mean, by the way, that's the exception, not the rule. I have a very large collection of my own work stored in another building somewhere. So that's another story.
Gosh. So it's all
morning, and it's sorry.
It's all very much about the layering and the building up, and then the
yes. Well, it's about finding the painting in the materials. Yes, I mean, I decided upon the subject matter, but the content I'm gradually discovering of these paintings is light, it's shadow, And they're highly synthetic paintings, but the light, the sense of kind of the way it's evoked, the place and the time, I think is kind of vivid. It stands up to my experience and my memory. Yeah.
So then, as you've mentioned, you developed RSI and you had to change the style that you
had to change the whole way I approach my painting. I just physically could not, I couldn't paint for a long time. Let's leave it at that. So I had to devise a way of a different approach that was less time consuming. And at around about this time, I'm probably about 50 by this time. This painting was made about 20 years ago. But still being a creature, with a rather obsessive compulsive creature, who needs a method and needs a system. What I did here, I'll just describe it very briefly. It's a new build in the west of Ireland. There's a huge building thing going on in the 80s, the Celtic Tiger, etc. The background to a lot of the pictures is invariably socio-political, but it's not worn in an explicit way, okay? It's like the environmental issues in the flower paintings are implicit in the choices I make about how to proceed with the paintings, not sort of, I don't know, apocalyptic imagery per se, So here we have economic boom of a kind. But what I've done here is, just bear with me a second, I paint a red ground and it's cadmium scarlet, okay? So all the colours are very high chromatic colours. That dries. Then I paint the cream of the end building. That's not painted grey. That's all cream, as are the chimneys and the pink and the blue, and the grey walls. All the local colour in the cars, they're all painted in local colour, right?
Yeah.
Okay, there's no tonal, there's no modelling. Then the whole thing is covered in Payne's grey. So those roofs are Payne's grey over cadmium scarlet, get it? Which actually is a very good, it's mimetic of ceramic tile, pan tiles and that kind of earthenware thing. But the whole thing's covered in liquid. So then what I have to do is I wipe off, and I say, putting the paint down takes, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. Getting it to the right consistency is another matter, but I'll come to that later. So then I take a rag and I wipe off 90%. So I've wiped off the side of the little chimneys, one half of that, and then I wipe off on the face, because the light's coming from the left, obviously, out of shot, as it were.
Yeah.
And so that pitch of the wall, the end of the concrete wall, and the pitch of the house to the end wall of the house, and the pitch on the thing is perfect, because it's not painted in a mimetic way. I'm not going, I think I haven't quite matched that tonally. I glaze a whole lot.
Yeah.
Right? So you're looking through grey stuff, yellow stuff. Get it? So going back to that early painting, I'm one of those people who's very aware and celebrates the materiality, the reality, the physicality of painting, the reality of painting, the phenomena. As I go back to the Manet thing, take joy in the object as well as the subject. Yeah,
which is really clear looking through these. So this is from around the same period.
Yeah, right? This is the early part of this century, 2003, 2007 or something.
This is 2007, yeah.
Yeah. Basically, I want the method is the same. Paint a ground, it dries. Paint the local colour of this, and that's very Irish. These funny off-key colours. You think, who would actually go out and buy a can of green paint that looked like that? You know what I mean? Well, I would, is the answer, because my house is painted that colour. But then, of course, it's a colour in Irish culture, not just because of the tricolour and Irish politics and history. Colour's important. Trust me. I'm not going to go into a seminar about the history of colour in the Republic, etc. But one thing that's important here is the whole of that painting was painted. So I'll go through it in sequence. Lemon background dries. Local colour, which is the green, that sour green of the building and the two chimney stacks, that dries. And as does the little blue building, the pink one, and the rather purple. You can see where it's going with the colour. People are painting their houses really bright and beginning to celebrate ownership and again, dominion, as it were. So, and then that all dries, and then I mask up the roof and a few other bits, and then the whole thing gets coated with Payne's grey, wipe it off with a cloth. And if you look at the roof, it's got this wonderful jump in tonal things from where the light's coming from the right, the telegraph pole. So you've got the highlight on the right-hand roof, the shadow, and the pitch from change of pitch from the wall facing right to the thing is perfect pitch. Get it? And it has to be in pitch because it's painted. I'm painting a shadow. I'm not painting a roof. I think that's magical. I really do. I still find that captivating. And simple little things like having to put the bin out. You know, it may be kind of bucolic, but still these people actually have to sort of, you know, wash up, pay the rates, go to work and put the rubbish out, you know, and pay council tax or whatever. And of course, one final touch is the signpost that faces away from you. So it's a bit like sort of that wonderful Caspar Friedrich thing where the two guys are looking out over the landscape. And it's one of the most vivid psychological forms of projection I've ever seen, because we look at what they're looking at, but they're getting in the way. And there's something sort of faintly irksome and wonderfully beguiling about that as well. And I thought, yeah, but I give the game away by saying I think it's called House near Drina or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Drina's near Skibbereen, where I used to live. Yeah.
Okay.
West Cork. Yeah.
Yeah. This is also from.
Yeah. This is Benin. This is actually where I used to live. This is a view from our house. But the reason I put this in, this presages, this is the precursor to everything that's in the studio. This painting behind me, which is Carrie Moon, which is painted the year before last. The method is here. So that's rose doré on a board, painted, and you can see it striped so it breathes. It's got the white ground showing through, so it's not opaque, right? That dries, and the whole thing's painted in Payne's grey. And this is a plein air painting, to use that wonderful expression. I'm outside, but what I've done is I put the Payne's grey down, quickly located the sky, and then with the other end of the brush, the wrong end of the brush, the pointy bit, scratch through the surface. You can actually see where the wires are scratched, telegraph pole, and various furrows in the fields and stuff. And then I take it back indoors and get a rag and wipe out all the fields to reveal the shadows. And again, what am I painting? Shadow, light.
Absolutely.
But it's embedded in an object, and I find that for me is the absolute duality of painting. It's that discovery. I mean, you know, I'm not the first person. I mean, you know, that rediscovery, but new to me. But rediscovery is something that drives me on. I think, yeah. I find it beguiling, and it's not because I'm being vain. It's because I don't think it's a great painting or anything like that. It's not about being happy or even liking it. And I mean, that's a whole other ballpark. I've written an essay about, you know, the word like in the context of art. I don't use it, and I don't think one can, because it doesn't mean anything. It's what you think about it that leads you to be a positive or have something problematic. If I find painting perplexing or irksome, then I'm engaged with it, yeah? And that's what this leads me to think, where can I take this? What can happen with this? Where does this lead? Anyway, yeah.
So it led you to, well, this is much more recent, it's 5 years ago, and you're really, light is so much the subject here, isn't it? It's
a painting that is about perception, about phenomenology, about, I'm not going to, get into the sort of the heavy stuff like that. But this painting, not in 20 minutes, you're not, because there's a lot more to get through. But the issue does come up again. But this is basically a painting about perception, or misperception, more correctly. Yeah. Okay. Everybody is conversant with the bucolic idea of boats floating around in a harbour, and it's kind of sort of. I choose it because it's neutral and it's familiar, yeah? But then you start to look at it, and of course, the number of times somebody's asked me whether it's upside down.
But you did paint it upside down.
Hold on. No, I just go to that again, just for the sake of the viewers. I paint the cerulean blue and white ground, because I want a opaque ground. I want it calcified. Right, so that dries. Then I paint and by the way, it's the other way up, because I cannot think upside down, let alone paint upside down. So I have to paint the houses. Anything that's upside down, and you can see it's painted before the rest. Okay, so the sequence is blue ground, local colour on the walls, the pink and the lemon house, right, and the white house, right? Mm-hmm. Then the Payne's grey is painted, and there's liquid, and all of that Payne's grey and the houses, the graphic little marks that you can see dangling down into the water, those are made afterwards, but everything dries in a very sequential way, rather like somebody making a print, yes? Like a lithograph, the way you would go, colour A dries, colour B. So it's very schematic, yeah. Anyway, so then there's one huge turning point comes. So the houses have their local modelling, that's all painted, and you can actually see through. And then finally, I mask up all these sort of spotted, these ellipses, and trust me, drawing ellipses in perspective to get them into the kind of perspective you want, you know, not at that angle or that angle, but at that angle. That way madness lies. Eventually, I decided to draw a set and got a guy to make some stencils for me. The only trouble was, I thought I would use the stencil in the negative, and then I suddenly thought, well, you can't see where you're placing it. So I quickly rushed out to the dustbin and got the bits that had been cut out, the ellipses, and those are the bits I now use, of course. Anyway, so I place them across the surface and draw around them, mask it up, and then the whole thing is glazed from top to bottom, right, with Payne's grey, to give this sense of recession and depth. But then, and only then, I paint 1, 2, 3 white figures on the thing. They're the boats, right? But I'm not just painting the boats. I'm painting the boats and I'm painting their reflections. And I'm painting the reflection with the same degree of reality or believing in their physicality as much as I do the physicality of the things that are being reflected. Does that make sense? Right. So the only things that are in the fictitious space which we, the viewer, are standing in is half of that orange boat, half of the yellow boat, and half of the green boat. The rest is in the water, is in this other reality.
Yeah.
The thing I wanted to do was to make sure that those reflections and those I think there's wonderfully convincing shadows, which are just simply, they're glazed on afterwards, as are the boats, to give them this sense of three-dimensionality. And of course, the gradation of the tonal range, you know, it's closer toned in the green boat than it is in the yellow boat, as it is in the orange boat. So all of it's it's studied, and it's about the idea of, as I say, it's phenomenological in that it's about light, it's about shadow, and it's about the perception of such things.
Yeah.
And how we go about remembering the world and reinventing the world. And there's something wonderful about the synthetic reality that is painting, and that's a hook. Anyway, so that's painted. Was it 5 years ago? Yes, about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
There are 1 or 2 other versions of this painting. Yeah. Then I moved to East Anglia 6 years ago, because don't forget, I don't necessarily leave Ireland and stop painting about things Irish. You get it? I mean, it's in the DNA. It's in the what's it. But I now live near a place called damn it.
Orfordness.
Thank you. Yes, Orfordness, which is a place where they built the most amazing things. The original nuclear bunkers are there, called the pagodas. They are beautiful and scary sort of buildings, extraordinary buildings. This is a blast shelter because the whole thing is gravel. It's a big spit or an island or an islet where it's RSPB run it along with. So it's a bird sanctuary, but everywhere you go, there's just these cone-shaped craters in the gravel where they've been letting off ordnance and bombs of various kinds over the intervening 30 or 40 years. Because this was a live ammunition sort of place and bomb testing site for years. But I suddenly realised that in the distance was this tower could be seen through this thing. Yeah. And it was just the idea that it had this wonderfully domestic feel, like a picture on a wall in this dilapidated. Oh, but the one thing I wanted to draw people's attention to is the piece of painting on the left. That is all painted alla prima, you know, just grey, and then overpainted with the charcoal grey. Yeah.
Okay. So a bit like that earlier one-shot painting.
Well, hold on, not quite, because obviously the blue dries. The one-shot painting is wet into wet.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a minute, because Manet's wet into wet was colour A on top and into colour B. I actually have a wet surface and use just Payne's grey. Get it? So I'm doing wet into wet painting because the pigment is obviously wet and malleable, but the surface is also wet. But the colour underneath, whether it's pink, this pale blue, whatever, is dry.
Okay, sure.
It's a support, it's a surface.
Yeah.
Now, okay.
Example A.
Yeah, example A. This is it indeed. This is Shingle Street, which again is it's called Shingle Street because it used to be near the coast. And if the other side of these houses, how much do you need to know? Yeah, the East Coast is subject to devastating erosion. Anybody who knows anything about the East Coast knows the myth of Dunwich, the fact that there was this huge seaport there with, I don't know, half a dozen churches and 59 pubs or something, and it's somewhere out just off Dogger Bank now. It's just washed away. It's gone. In the graveyards, fell in the sea with very macabre consequences, etc. Anyway, so this place used to be on the seaside, and as a kind of, not quite a resort, but it was a place to go, to be on the seaside. But now, of course, you've got to walk half a mile to get to the coast. Get it? So this is the reverse. This is probably Dunwich. It's been dumped down here because it's south of Dunwich. It's called Shingle Street. And again, I'm just attracted to these vernacular, these unassuming, slightly forgotten, neglected buildings. The other thing is, of course, because of their slightly kind of heaving, groaning, sort of worn sort of shape and form, they lend themselves to this amazingly immediate form of painting. I'll just run through it very quickly. It's a very pale pink ground, as you've probably noticed. Yeah. Right, that is dried, and then over the whole thing is painted is a coat of liquid, and then the paint is put down. It's Payne's grey. You can see what's happened. I mean, this is truth to materials of the most blindingly obvious sort. You can actually see every brushstroke, and if you were to see the painting, you'd see everything that's constructed here, the aspect of the roofs, the direction in which the paint's put down in the foreground that gives you this foreshortening, the tufts of grass and the foreshortening, and the sky. There's an internal logic to every stroke, and it has a function. And something about that, I find that satisfying.
Yeah. And
then, of course, one final detail, a little bit of local colour. Couldn't avoid the window frames. They have to be a sort of utilitarian green, that kind of slightly sour.
Brilliant.
This is the painting that is behind me on the wall, by the way.
Of course, yeah.
Called Carrie Moon. After painting this, and don't forget, I lived here. I used to ride around with my boys, and we used to ride trail bikes all over these peninsulas on the very west of Ireland, treeless and fairly bleak, with these sheds. And this shed, we would always sort of, we'd stop here because because it was a convenient place, etc. Anyway, so took photographs, made little drawings, did bits and bobs, became familiar with this shed. And don't forget, it's of no it's not distinguished in any sense architecturally. In fact, that was what was attractive about it. So very similar method. Here we've got a lemon ground, cadmium lemon, dries. A few days later, paint up, polymerized resin, liquid over the whole surface. And then, and this is really important, the paint was put on from the right side. Everything was painted, from the left side to the right side. It's as if I'm painting to the light, but from the shadow. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So when it comes to painting the building, there's these long shadows. I painted the shadows before I painted the wall.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, the implications of that are really interesting because not only do I'm familiar with the building, I mean, if I get the pitch of the roof wrong, I mean, who's going to it's not nobody's going to complain about it. There's a license here. And then I suddenly realized that everything could be constructed. And if you look carefully, you can actually see it's done with what are called combs that decorators would have used for wood graining and stuff. You see scratches for the corrugated metal and things, because it's all, and corrugated metal is a gift to somebody who wants to paint like this, because it gives you a surface, it gives you something to paint, right? And it also gives you something that can catch the light, as it does on the hills. And if you look at the hills in the background, this figure ground thing, everything is reliant upon everything around it for its identity, for its sense of itself.
Yeah.
And a lot of rubbing down, a lot of repainting, but basically I'm painting shadows. The subject matter is bucolic, it's the landscape, but the content is light.
Yeah.
And experience.
I think we've got 2 left from your most recent series. We should actually be in questions now. So
yeah, okay. Right. So this is called A Love of Many Things. I did a show, which was a big museum show last year, which was at Peterborough. And there is a PDF on my website of the show. And there's also, it went to Drogheda in Ireland as well. Went to the Highlands Gallery in Drogheda. Basically, the method's the same. But here, I was beginning to think a lot more about, and again, this device about somebody, you know, in nature, in the world, a sort of a modest nod to the Caspar Friedrich painting that I've already mentioned. The idea of sort of you're sharing their experience in some absurdly vicarious sort of way. Yeah. But the conceit that it might be able to be happening is a wonderful idea. And if you look again, everything is constructed around everything else, and it has this, what I regard as this psychologically a miasmic sort of feel to it, that nothing is separate, nothing exists in its own, by itself, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
It's kind of a very hard painting to keep focus on. Yeah. And that's pretty much the intention. I think one more version.
Discovering different things as the longer you look.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Hold on. Like the bird that flies across the bottom of this version with its funny little shadow in the pathway leading up to the chair and the table. In the bottom right, there's a little bird flying across the bottom there. In the pathway, in the gap between the 2 vertical stripes. I listen, trust me, it's on the painting here.
I believe you.
Here, Sally is still in the garden, and it's a rose doré ground. But if you look at the ground, this ground, instead of being flat, look at the top left hand, it's actually striated and banded, so it's irregular. It's much more kind of, it heaves with the Payne's grey, and a few bits of charcoal grey which heighten it. Anyway, that's what I've been doing recently.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to thank you so much for that whirlwind tour. I'm going to stop.
I'm sorry. Yeah, listen, it's a bit like some Précine Proust or something. You know, 50 years of how's it been?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just gonna remind people, we're gonna take some questions now. I know we're slightly over time, but I'm sure everyone wants to ask questions. I'm gonna remind people that the chat is in the middle at the bottom of the screen. If you could type your questions into there, and then I'll read them out as they come in. Sorry, I'm just trying to make it so I can see it. We don't have any yet, so you hopefully there are some people typing.
I can see some busy typing, yeah. Can
you? Okay.
Fingers dangerously close to cameras, yeah.
I'm just trying to make this so I can actually read them when they come in.
Listen, I gave a lecture once where nobody, no, more than once, I've given lectures where we stopped and at the end said, so, any questions? And dead silence, and you think, well, yeah. But it's because if you give up the whole thing and you don't hide or you don't fence, and I try not to prevaricate or be obtuse, and God knows I've been at enough lectures where people have. I've tried really hard to be thorough, to be rigorous about it. If it does take 2 or 3 viewings, so be it. It's dense, and that forgive me. That's 50 years of in 35 minutes.
Okay, we do actually have a question in the
meantime. Whirlwind with the understatement. One question that has come up was after that silence at one college. a woman said, "So why do you call yourself a painter and not an artist?" That provoked, I wouldn't say heated, but kind of wonderfully perplexed sort of conversation amongst the people in the room, because I wasn't allowed to answer it before a debate or an argument broke out in the room about that. And I thought, that's fine, my job's done.
Yeah,
yeah. If you have a problem with that, so be it. I don't.
Sadly, we have that conversation in the room, but we've got a lot of questions coming in now. Everyone's
good.
Right, a lot of fingers going very fast. So the first one is from Rosalind, and it says, could Graham say a little more about curating an art education? Oh, it's moving. About curating an art education, because you're so involved in these fields.
Oh gosh, yes, Rosalind, I can. It's just that I think it'll probably take another session. About art education, well, I mean, I think the short or the most direct answer to this is for people to visit my website and have a look at the things I've been writing since 2007. And when it comes to education, art education particularly, I feel, I actually, this is complicated stuff, but I feel really privileged, and I come from a background without paintings, without books and all the rest of it. And I was introduced to what's called culture, and it opened so many doors and gave meaning in so many different forms. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Yes? Okay, right. Okay. I have valued that, and I think that's something that it's the stuff of which a sense of, from my sense of my humanity and my sense of the social is actually constructed, yeah. And I have seen, I mean, that's been constantly under attack, and so I write in defence of education as a. And don't forget, there isn't one hat I don't wear in this debate. I've been a professor. I've been transformed personally by it. I'm a taxpayer. I'm a parent, you know. And I feel passionately about it, and to see it commodified and it's which is why I'm so passionate, you know, given the opportunity to talk to people about it, to share what I regard as a very rich and sort of a wonderful experience, really, a range of experiences, because also the people I've had the opportunity to meet. You know, I mean, I was, what should I say, got the chance to actually not just listen to Richard Wollheim lecture, but to actually meet him and talk about painting with Richard Wollheim, particularly after having read that wonderfully dense book with the title Painting as a Fine Art. You think, oh, right, I think I know where this is going. But it was, you know, and John Golding and then the contemporaries, the people I've you know, the people I've met. So that's I'm passionate about that, as Rosalind is well aware, because I met Rosalind at the Royal College, which was, good grief, that must have been 15, 16 years ago. Yeah, go on, a few more than that, Rosalind. Is it 10 years? No, it's more than that, 15 years ago. Thank you, yeah. And anyway, and I think we, you know, she knows perfectly well that we share this passion. The idea of sharing, the idea of generosity. See, that's why I don't call myself an artist particularly, because I'm not very happy about the shape or condition of the art world, if I'm honest. Yeah. And as I say, in the time available, I don't want to get into a kind of polemic about money laundering and you know, and the sanctimony anyway, some artists, etc. One thing I will say about curating is every summer, well, yeah, this summer, I was talking to somebody recently, it's a bit like 2020 hasn't happened yet, you know, I'm still waiting. So there's going to be a group show each summer. There are group exhibitions here in this studio. It's quite a big studio. I'm very fortunate. And of course, the one this year has had to be postponed until summer 2021. In answer to Rosalind's question, I think it's a vital part of actually what I do, because I actually believe painting, obviously it's an activity, it's something that you do, but that's not the whole story. Painting is a discourse, and in order to create discourse, you have to be in contact with other people, you have to be in contact with their work, you have to be sharing stuff. And so it's not about product identity, it's not about how rich you are, it's not about whether, because I find that the one terrible thing that's happened to society generally is this horrible toxic triangle, the confluence between celebrity, capital and media. Yeah, I operate entirely outside of that circus. Okay, and that's probably why I've been invited to talk to people today, because I have nothing to sell, but quite a lot, I think, to share. And I think that's a totally different, so I'm not commodified in that sort of way. And I don't worry about product identity. I don't worry about continuity. If I get bored tomorrow, I'll do something completely different and my work will change because my need has changed. I haven't wanted always to make these things, but I've certainly needed to make them, for the existential and all the other sort of reasons that one needs to do stuff.
Great. Okay, we've got.
Is that some kind of answer, Rosalind? I hope so. Oh, good. Well done. Thank you.
We've got 8 quite detailed questions.
Go on. I'll try and go as quickly as I can. Go on.
Oh, in fact, another one's just coming. Yeah, we're going to have to go through them quite fast. Someone's interested, Emma Bruttington, you said you've lived a third of your life in Ireland. How does location and movement of your life influence your work and the work you make and its reception and your audience?
That's interesting. First of all, it's profoundly important. I mean, it's a bit like I have 2 boys and they have 2 boys. So the idea of where I live, my family, it's about attachment. I care passionately about Irish culture, Irish history. My family were formed in it. We chose to live in Ireland, and it has informed my work and my approach to culture more widely. So it's without location, I think I'd still be a fairly formalist, academic, sort of not very interesting person or painter. And sorry, the second part of the question?
And how it's affected the reception of the work in the audience.
Oh, well, blimey. I think everybody has some experience of landscape. I mean, not everybody can, the painting of the boats drifting around, that has been shown in loads of exhibitions. It's one in Poland, blah, blah, been all over the place. And the reception has been positive because people suddenly realise that it's not necessarily they haven't been to West Cork, particularly the people in Poland, obviously, very few of them anyway. It's the fact that they've actually shared that kind of moment as a moment of reflection, no pun intended, but it's actually the idea of quiet reflection, being self-aware, self-remembering, okay? There's a whole area here that I haven't talked about that has influenced my thinking. And if I tell you that as a student, I saw no incongruity about stomping around with Marx under one arm and Gurdjieff under the other, and it takes me back to the thing about theosophy and stuff, its influence on the visual arts. Yeah. But I'm digressing. Sorry, I hope that answers the question. So it's so profound. I don't think I could function without place.
Talking of profound, I mean, all of these questions are really profound. So I don't know, you're just going to have to give a very brief.
All right, go on.
Sorry. Justin wants you to say a bit more about the term post-conceptual painting, which as both an artist and teacher has been so helpful to open discourse about where we are now.
Yeah, okay, right. Okay, post-conceptual painting, right. Conceptual art was the dominant discourse when I was a student, and the corollary of that, for if you were not you're a bit lazy, was painting was dead, blah, blah, blah. I watched what was happening. I went to the seminars. I was a very good student, right? I knuckled down and I did the work. and I was in the room listening to the debates, and it changed my approach to painting. It made me think differently about the idea of creativity and the creative process more widely. And I've carried that all the way through that, the crisis, the late modernist, postmodern, into this situation where I suddenly realized that the level playing field and the kind of space that we occupy now collectively and culturally is actually because I feel that the legacy of conceptual art or conceptualism, it's changed the way I think about about painting, about what I do, how I approach it. And I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people, I'm not going to name names, but I think there's a lot of people out there these days that don't think it's gone to hell in a handcart, or that conceptual art was the worst thing that ever happened to humankind, and all that sort of stuff. I actually think it was a wake-up call to the kind of, the rather pious, rather sanctimonious, quasi-religious sort of, the chapels of modernity sort of stuff, the kind of those corporate corridors with paintings that said practically nothing to anybody that happened to be looking at them. It's a kind of sort of corporate dumb show. And at one time, of course, there used to be a thing called the art world, which was actually separate and was moving in a different direction to the art market. This was a two-way traffic. But of course, I think somebody's already laughing at this because they remember it. And you could have conversations about like something really kind of completely bonkers. You were on the planet Zog, and reality had no bearing on the conversation. And the art market was the art market, without morality, and get down and make some money. And around about the mid-80s, we all know how society changed profoundly in the 80s, etc., etc. The art world became colonized or subsumed. It was like watching some huge sort of, if ever you've seen Melancholia, that wonderful Lars von Trier film, where this planet just engulfs and consumes humankind and that's the art world. The discourse was swallowed by this kind of PR, kind of corporate speak, rather sanctimonious sort of speak that quietened down and definitely, tempered the polemic. In fact, it was a bit like a purging, as it were, of the left and of a lot of skepticism, and I think skepticism is the mainstay of a lot of what I do, not even trusting my own judgment in most things, let alone other people's.
I just interrupt and flag up that Rosalind has posted a link, which I think everyone else ought to also be able to see in the group chat, a YouTube link to a talk that you and she, I think, did about post-conceptual painting.
Oh yes.
For Paint Lounge, which she's saying is well worth a listen, of course. So
she was actually there at the talk and was one of the three people, but I was the one, as unsurprisingly, who, and Rosalind would probably have been saying this, dominated the conversation. So basically, what it amounts to is it's not just painting that happened after conceptual art historically in any linear way. It's painting that signals cognizance. It acknowledges the legacy of conceptualism. Yeah, the fact that thinking about creativity generally changed. The breadth of reference, or the kind of stuff that was that we would discuss was much broader and has remained so. And I'm thankful for that.
Okay, we've got a couple of technical questions. So there's a couple about your layers. Can I ask if you apply the resin, if it's dry? Sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand it, but do you basically, I think it's asking if the layer's dry before you apply the refine on top, and what resin do you use?
Okay, right, hold on. Right, I don't use a palette. Yeah. I mix the paint on the surface because the actual mixing and the actual behaviour of the paint is which is why this painting is on the wall behind me, and why Little Black City was so important. It happened in the material, right? And that's its own reality. That's that Manet duality thing, as I say. Right. I use Liquin, Winsor and Newton's Liquin, and there are 2 or 3 kinds, and the one to use is called Liquin Original, and it has to be in a tin because it's photochromatic, or whatever the term is. It's light sensitive. It starts off as sort of faintly beige and ends up looking like, oh God, it looks like old engine oil after a year or 2 if it's left in the light. And so, yes, it's the heat, the flies. So it's Liquin Original, and in all cases, and this is absolutely key, is it's wet, because in order to paint into it, for obvious reasons, it has to be wet, it has to be viscous. And so you can draw through it with paint or whatever and drag the paint through it. I mean, my advice to anybody who's interested in trying to do this, and I'll tell you, it really puts you in the moment, yeah? Because you've got to watch what's happening. I'll tell you what it's like. It's like doing a monotype. You know the way you put an oil down on a piece of glass and then you introduce whatever it is, your oil painted black or whatever it is to it, and then you scrub it down and manipulate it. Not dissimilar to that, only that's the object. So it's monotype without the printing, if you follow me in the method. Very similar to that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, there's various questions about.
If there are any other questions, I've got a website, by the way, and people.
I've got on the final slide, so yeah, I think we're going to have to. I'd be
very happy, more than happy, as Rosalind knows, and Justin and various other people who've met me, and Freya, who are here today. I'm more than happy to enter into a conversation, because I think that's the bread and butter of this business, making the stuff and then generating kind of, I don't know, not just being excited by it, but as I say, being irked by it, being perplexed by it. And that's, as I say, there are essays on my website as well, particularly the one I don't like art. That is key. And I think in 1 or 2 cases, there's Justin sticking his thumb, yes, because it's become a text for a few courses, sort of, what should I say, just north of the Thames, apparently.
Okay, I think what we're going to do then is I'm going to randomly pick one of these questions and then we'll finish, and then I'll put up as a link to your website, and then people can read stuff on there and maybe contact you through that. And I'm really going to apologise to everyone that we don't get through everything, but hopefully it was worth it for listening to you for longer in the first place. So yeah, no, I mean, thank you. That's why it's generated so many questions. Okay, as a last one then, how much do you use sketchbooks and draw from observation, and how much of your recent work is remembered or imagined?
Remembered, hell of a lot. Let's say, I rely upon memory a hell of a lot. I have as anybody who knows me, I have a very, very vivid and slightly overwhelming memory. Yeah, I mean, I have flashbacks, but not in the kind of, sort of PTSD sort of stuff, but I am able to relive things very vividly, okay? And that's why I sort of study landscape, I think, a lot, in order to have focus and to try and focus up those memories, to condense them, to focus them on a particular point or experience. I rely upon, so that the main thing is my memory. Then probably equally, you can't paint paintings like the one of the housing estate without working out where stuff goes and and playing around with perspective and stuff. And you can't play with the viewpoint, or I can't, with cameras, and I can't, I have very limited skills when it comes to computers, so that's not going to happen. So drawing, photography, memory, I use all of them. And actually, it's a good question, because that's where the synthesis lies, at the kind of the nexus of these 3 sort of elements. They create a particular kind of this is, I wrote it down. So yeah, it's the idea of kind of like a trig point when you can locate something. It's like capturing thought, yeah, or capturing a thought. And it lives outside of time after a while. Yeah, you know, I mean, paintings are made in time, but they exist out of time. Something I'll never do. You get it? Yeah. I think that's really interesting stuff. And as I say, I've always found painting perplexing, frustrating, distracting, rewarding, and it's never, I'm never satisfied by it as well, my own work, as it were, because I always think there's something more I want to do, well, need to do more correctly. There's something else I can do.
That's a good thing. If you were satisfied and stopped, then that would be a shame.
Well, yeah, but you know, let's face it, this is why I'm a painter and an artist. I'm not interested in the art market, and I make no bones about it. What happened at Blaine Southern recently, I don't know if anybody knows about that. That was symptomatic of the kind of milieu that is the art market. Yeah, I'm happy ploughing my own shallow, remote furrow, you know, bumping along. Yeah. So product identity and the issues that surround commodification, you know, painting is complicated enough without actually being somebody else's donkey, basically.
Yeah.
Pet.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm really sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't get to, but I'm going to put up the link in a minute to Graham's website, and I just want to say thank you so much to Graham, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today via Zoom, and thank you to everyone who's watching this at a later date, and of course a huge thank you also to Heatherleys for hosting this series of online improvisations and talks. So I'm going to put...
Can I say one thing? Yeah, as I say, don't hesitate to email me with questions, and I will obviously attempt to answer them as best I can. It won't necessarily happen in the next 28 or 48 hours, but I will try very hard to answer all questions you've got. And there are lots of short films and texts on the website.
Yeah, so the website is now on the screen, as is the Heatherleys website and Facebook page. So just to flag up that next Friday, Rosalind Davis will be back with another professional development talk. And then I'll be back the week after that talking to Simon Davis, no relation as far as I know. So these will be being announced, and the Zoom links will be being put into the blurbs on the Heatherleys page and Facebook page. And as Graham has said, there's his website, so do contact him. And yeah, all I meant to say is, again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Heatherleys. Thank you to Graham. And I know this is the point at which you would be getting a loud round of applause. So if we can just have a virtual round of applause, that would be great. And yeah, I'm going to have to just unceremoniously end the meeting and kick everyone out, I'm afraid. But thank you.
Thank you.